The shove was hard, deliberate. It sent the girl stumbling back against the porch railing, the wood groaning under the impact. Her name was Sarah. She was 17. The boy who had shoved her was Kyle Thorne, and he stood over her with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no. His friends watched from the lawn, their phones held up, recording, not to document a crime, but to capture a conquest, a sick trophy for later. From the edge of the porch, a low growl rumbled. Max, a German shepherd whose graying muzzle did nothing to diminish the power in his frame, moved between the boy and the girl. He did not bark. He did not snap. He simply stood, a living barrier of loyalty and muscle, his eyes locked on the threat. Kyle sneered. "Get your stupid mutt out of my face, Sarah." When the dog did not move, Kyle's leg swung out in a vicious arc. The kick landed squarely in the shepherd's ribs. A pained yelp tore through the quiet afternoon air, and the dog collapsed, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The cruelty of the act was stunning in its simplicity. It was a message. I can hurt what you love, and no one will stop me. John Creed was trying to lose himself in the rhythm of hard labor. The sun beat down on his back as he hauled another bucket of dirt and rock from the old well. He had bought this small plot of land, miles from anywhere, for this exact reason. To be alone. To work until his muscles screamed louder than the memories. The well was his penance, his therapy, a hole in the ground he could pour his ghosts into. But Max, his own dog, had been a nuisance all morning. The shepherd, a retired military dog just like the one he'd given Sarah, refused to settle. He whined at the edge of the woods, his ears twitching, his gaze fixed on the road leading to the girl's house. John had dismissed it. Nerves, old training kicking in. Then he heard it, a sound that cut through the hum of the cicadas and the whisper of the wind, a dog's cry of pain. It was a sound he knew from the battlefield, a sound of innocence betrayed. He dropped the shovel. Max was already moving, a black and tan blur streaking through the trees, a silent acknowledgement that his master had finally understood the warning. John followed, his long legs eating up the distance. He moved not with panic, but with a cold, terrifying efficiency. The dormant circuits in his brain, the ones forged in the crucible of SEAL training, flared to life. Analyze, approach, neutralize. He emerged from the tree line just as Kyle Thorne raised his foot for a second kick. This one aimed at the downed dog's head. John didn't shout. He didn't run. He simply spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a granite slab. Let him go. The words stopped Kyle cold. He turned, his face a mask of annoyed surprise. He saw a man standing at the edge of the lawn, tall, lean, with the kind of stillness that was more menacing than any overt threat. John's eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on him. They held no anger, no fear. They held nothing but a flat, professional calm that was deeply unsettling. "Who the hell are you?" Kyle demanded, his bravado returning. His friends snickered behind him. John took one step forward, then another. He didn't look at the boys with their phones. He didn't look at Sarah, who was now kneeling beside her injured dog, tears streaming down her face. He only looked at Kyle. "I said, let him go," John repeated. The temperature of the air seemed to drop. For the first time in his pampered life, Kyle Thorne felt a flicker of genuine fear. This man wasn't a neighbor to be intimidated or a teacher to be bought. This was something different, something ancient and dangerous. He took an involuntary step back. "Whatever," he spat, trying to save face. Come on, guys! He and his friends swaggered back to their expensive cars, laughing a little too loudly. John watched them go, his posture unchanging until the sound of their engines faded down the road. Only then did he move. He knelt beside Sarah and Max. He ran his hands over the dog's ribs, his touch gentle but firm, checking for brakes. Max whined softly but licked his hand. John's own dog, the one who had led him here, sat a few feet away, a silent, furry sentinel. "He's hurt," Sarah whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "He tried to protect me." "I know," John said. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw her father in her eyes, his teammate, his brother, a man who had died in a dusty hell half a world away, a man John had promised he would look out for his family, a promise he felt he had failed every single day. He helped her get Max inside. The dog could walk, but his breathing was labored. John examined him more thoroughly on the living room rug, concluding the ribs were badly bruised, not broken. He would be sore for a week. He would heal. Sarah sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, shivering despite the warmth of the day. The shock was setting in. John looked around the small, neat house. Photos of her father in uniform were on the mantelpiece. A smiling man with his arm around a younger Sarah. A hero. He turned back to the girl. She looked so small, so vulnerable. The cold rage that he had kept locked away for years began to stir in the pit of his stomach. It was a familiar feeling, an old friend he had tried to forget. He sat in the chair opposite her. He waited for her to speak. They filmed it," she said, her voice barely audible. "They'll put it online. Everyone will see." "Let them," John said. His voice was steady, a rock in her sea of fear. "My dad. He used to say that bullies only have power if you give it to them," she said, more to herself than to him. "But Kyle, his father owns everything. The police, the school. Everyone is afraid of him." John leaned forward slightly. He met her gaze, and for the first time since he'd returned from the war, his own eyes felt clear. The fog of grief and guilt began to recede, replaced by a singular, unyielding purpose. "Look at me, Sarah." She lifted her head. "This ends," he said. The words were not a boast. They were a statement of fact. "This ends today. I promise you." It was a promise made in the quiet of a violated home, witnessed by two loyal dogs. It was a promise that would shake a corrupt town to its very foundations. It was a promise a Navy SEAL never broke. Later that evening, his phone rang. An unknown number. He answered. "Is this Mr. Creed?" The voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with condescension. "Who is this?" John asked. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I believe you had an encounter with my son today." John said nothing. "Listen," Thorne continued, his tone shifting to one of feigned reason. "Boys will be boys. I'm sure there was a misunderstanding. I'm prepared to offer a generous sum to compensate the girl for her emotional distress. And for the vet bills, of course. Let's say $20,000. It will be a lesson for my son, and you and the girl can forget this ever happened." The offer hung in the air, obscene in its arrogance. The assumption that everything and everyone had a price. John's voice was ice. "Your son assaulted a child and brutalized an animal. There is no price for that." Thorne's manufactured charm vanished. "You need to understand your position, Mr. Creed. You are new here. I am not. I built this town. I suggest you take the money and mind your own business. You have no idea what you are starting." A long silence stretched. John walked to his window and looked out at the dark woods. He saw the world through a different lens now, not as a place to hide, but as a battlefield. "No," John said softly. "You have no idea what I'm finishing." He hung up the phone. The first move had been made. The lines were drawn. The next morning, John drove Sarah to the police station. Max sat in the back of the truck, still sore but resolutely alert. The station was a small brick building that smelled of stale coffee and indifference. The officer at the desk listened to their story with a bored expression, his eyes occasionally flicking to the clock on the wall. He took their statement, his pen scratching slowly across the form. When Sarah mentioned Kyle Thorne's name, the officer paused. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Thorne, you said?" "Yes," John confirmed. The officer sighed, a weary, practiced sound. "We'll look into it," he said, the words a hollow promise. He handed them a case number and turned back to his paperwork. Dismissed. They left the station and went to the high school to speak with the principal. Principal Davies was a man whose posture seemed permanently bent from years of bowing to pressure. He listened patiently in his office, his hands steepled on his large oak desk. A plaque from the Thorne Foundation gleamed on the wall behind him. "Kyle is a spirited boy," Davies said when Sarah had finished. "And he is under a lot of pressure. His father is a very important member of our community." "He assaulted her," John stated flatly. "And there were witnesses." "Witnesses who tell a different story," Davies countered smoothly. "They say Sarah provoked the dog, and Kyle was simply defending himself. It's a classic case of he said, she said." The lie was so blatant, so perfectly constructed, that it left Sarah speechless. John felt that cold rage begin to simmer again. The system wasn't just broken. It was a willing accomplice. It was a wall built by Thorne's money to protect his own. "So you're not going to do anything?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "My hands are tied," the principal said, spreading his own in a gesture of false helplessness. "Without concrete proof, any disciplinary action would be seen as unfair." John stood up. He looked down at the man behind the desk. "You've made your position clear." They walked out of the school, the weight of the town's corruption settling on them. The message was unmistakable. You are alone. You are powerless. The harassment started that afternoon. The video of the assault appeared online, cleverly edited to make Sarah look like the aggressor. The comment section filled with vitriol, painting her as a liar and an attention seeker. Her so-called friends at school began to shun her. Whispers followed her in the hallways. That night, someone slashed the tires on John's truck, all 4 of them. He found them flat in the morning, the rubber sliced cleanly. There was no note. There didn't need to be. A few days later, a dead crow was left on Sarah's front porch, a grotesque warning. Sarah found it on her way to school. She didn't scream. She just stared at it, her face pale before going back inside and calling John. He came over and disposed of it without a word. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else growing there. A hard glint of defiance. The more they pushed, the less she bent. The physical escalation came a week after the first incident. Kyle and 2 of his friends cornered Sarah as she walked home from the bus stop. They didn't have their phones out this time. They blocked her path on the quiet country road. "Heard you went to the cops," Kyle sneered, stepping closer. "Heard you went to Davies. You're not very smart, are you?" Sarah stood her ground. Max wasn't with her. He was still recovering at home. She was alone. "Leave me alone, Kyle. My dad told me to tell you to drop it," he said, his voice low and menacing. He's giving you one last chance. He reached out and shoved her shoulder. This is your last chance. A truck engine rumbled to life from a dirt turnout 100 yards down the road. It was John's truck, the new tires glinting in the sun. It rolled toward them slowly, deliberately. John was behind the wheel, his expression unreadable through the windshield. Kyle and his friends froze. They looked from the approaching truck to Sarah, then back again. The truck didn't speed up. It just came on. A relentless, unstoppable force. There was no threat in its speed, but there was a terrifying promise in its steady advance. They scattered, jumping into their car parked nearby and peeling out, spraying gravel. John pulled up beside Sarah. He didn't get out. He just leaned over and opened the passenger door. "Get in," he said. She climbed into the truck, her hands shaking. "You were watching?" she asked. "I'm always watching," he replied. He put the truck in gear and drove her home. He knew then that this was a war, and you don't fight a war alone. That night, he sat in his small, Spartan cabin, the only light coming from the glow of a laptop screen. He made a call. The phone rang twice before it was answered. "Yeah." The voice on the other end was rough, clipped. "Reaper, it's Creed," John said. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "John boy. Thought you'd fallen off the face of the earth. Everything good?" "No," John said. "I'm in a situation. I need you." The humor in Reaper's voice vanished instantly, replaced by the same professional tone John used. "Where and when?" "I'll send you the coordinates. I need eyes and ears, full surveillance package, and I need Doc. There's a girl who needs looking after." "We're on our way," Reaper said. There was no hesitation, no questions about payment or legality. It was the code. A brother needed help. The team assembled. 2 days later, a nondescript van pulled up John's driveway. 2 men got out. Reaper was wiry, with a restless energy and fingers that seemed to dance over any piece of technology he touched. Doc was a mountain of a man, a former corpsman whose calm demeanor masked an encyclopedic knowledge of how to both heal and hurt the human body. They shook hands, a brief, firm gesture that said more than words ever could. John laid out the situation. He told them about Sarah, about her father, about the thorns, about the corrupted town. Reaper listened, a grim smile playing on his lips. A rich bully who thinks he's a king. I've seen this movie before. I like the ending where we burn his castle down. Doc simply nodded. "We'll keep her safe." While Reaper set up a discreet surveillance network, blanketing the Thorne estate and the approaches to Sarah's home with micro cameras and listening devices, John made another call. This one was to a number he'd gotten from a veterans support group. A woman answered. "Amelia Vance. My name is John Creed. I was told you might be interested in a story about Marcus Thorne." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "I'm always interested in a story about Marcus Thorne. I've been trying to get something to stick to that man for 5 years. What do you have?" "I have a victim who is willing to talk," John said. "And I have a promise to keep." They met the next day at a diner in the next county. Amelia Vance was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. John brought Sarah with him. At first, Sarah was hesitant, but as she listened to Amelia detail the other stories, the whispers of payoffs, the families who had suddenly moved away, the business rivals who had been mysteriously ruined, she began to understand she wasn't the first. "The problem has always been proof," Amelia said, stirring her coffee. "Thorne is meticulous. He uses lawyers and shell corporations. He never gets his own hands dirty, and his victims are always too scared to go on the record. She's not, John said, looking at Sarah. Sarah met the reporter's gaze. I'll talk, she said, her voice clear and strong. But I want to find the others, the ones who were too afraid. They deserve to be heard too. Amelia smiled, a real, genuine smile. I think we can arrange that. The final piece of the alliance fell into place with a call to Ben Carter. Carter was a lawyer, a former Marine JAG officer, who now ran a small pro bono practice dedicated to helping veterans and their families. His office was a cluttered room above a hardware store, but his reputation was impeccable. He was, as Reaper had put it, a pit bull in a cheap suit. Carter listened to the story without interruption, his face set in a grim mask. When John was finished, he leaned back in his squeaky chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Systemic corruption supported by a local oligarch, he said. Sounds like a Tuesday. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with John's. The law is a weapon. Right now, he's using it against you. It's time we picked it up and used it back. We'll file a civil suit. We'll file for an injunction. We'll subpoena his financial records. We'll make so much noise he won't be able to buy enough silence to cover it up. The team was assembled. The warrior, the technician, the medic, the journalist, and the lawyer. A network of the righteous. Amelia and John, with Doc providing discreet overwatch, began the painstaking work of tracking down the other victims. They found a family whose son had been crippled in a hit-and-run by Kyle Thorne, a case that had been dismissed for lack of evidence. They found a small business owner who had been forced to sell his land to Thorne for pennies on the dollar after a series of sudden, crippling code violations. One by one, they listened to the stories. They offered not judgment, but belief. They offered protection. Slowly, cautiously, the wall of fear Thorne had built began to crack. People started to agree to give anonymous statements to Amelia. A few even considered going on the record. Thorne felt the shift. He felt the ground moving beneath his feet. His quiet kingdom was being disturbed. His response was predictable. He escalated. He didn't understand a threat that couldn't be bought or intimidated, so he turned to the only other tool he knew: brute force. He believed that one final, brutal act of violence would crush this burgeoning rebellion and restore the fear he relied on. He was wrong. It was the gravest miscalculation of his life. The attack happened on a Thursday evening. Sarah was walking Max in the woods behind her house, a path she walked every day. It was her quiet time, a small piece of normalcy she clung to. Doc was supposed to be watching her, but he had been cleverly drawn away by a false report of a fire near John's cabin, a diversion that was just professional enough to be convincing. Kyle Thorne wasn't alone. He had his two friends with him. They came out of the trees, blocking her path. There was no sneering this time. Their faces were grim, their eyes cold. They were here to do a job. "You should have taken the money," Kyle said. Max immediately moved in front of Sarah, a deep, rumbling growl starting in his chest. He was still not at 100%, but his spirit was unbroken. One of Kyle's friends lunged, not at Sarah, but at the dog, tackling him and pinning him to the ground. Max thrashed and snapped, but the boy was strong. Kyle advanced on Sarah. She didn't run. She stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. She remembered what her father had told her. She remembered John's promise. "I'm not scared of you," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. That was the last thing she said before he hit her. The first blow sent her reeling. The world exploded in a flash of white pain. He hit her again and again. He was frantic, enraged that she wasn't cowering, that she wasn't begging. He was trying to beat the defiance out of her. Through the haze of pain, she fought back, not with strength, but with instinct. She clawed at his face, her fingernails digging deep into his skin, tearing away flesh and blood. It was a desperate, primal act. The third boy pulled her away, throwing her to the ground. Kyle stood over her, breathing heavily, a long, bleeding scratch running down his cheek. He kicked her in the side once, twice, before a distant shout signaled that Doc was returning. They fled into the woods, leaving her broken and unconscious on the forest floor. Max, finally free, scrambled to her side, licking her face, whining pitifully. It was Doc who found them moments later. It was Doc who gently scooped her up into his massive arms and carried her out of the woods. It was Doc who made the call to John, his voice strained with a fury he rarely showed. "John, they got to her. It's bad." John saw her in the hospital bed. One eye was swollen shut. Her lip was split. Dark bruises were already blooming on her face and arms. An IV tube snaked into her hand. She looked fragile, like a broken doll. But beneath the sterile white sheets, her right hand was clenched into a fist. The nurse had to gently pry it open. Under her fingernails were traces of skin and blood. Her last act of defiance. Crucial evidence. John stood by the bed for a long time, his face a granite mask. Reaper and Doc stood by the door, silent. The entire world seemed to shrink until it was just this room, this girl, and the promise he had made. The professional calm he had maintained for so long finally evaporated. It wasn't replaced by hot, uncontrolled anger. It was replaced by something far more dangerous. A glacial cold, a clarity of purpose so absolute it was terrifying. He turned and looked at Reaper. "The book is closed," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the room with the finality of a death sentence. "We end this. Tonight." Reaper just nodded. "Give me 3 hours." While Doc stayed at the hospital to guard Sarah's room, John and Reaper returned to the cabin. It was no longer a refuge. It was a command center. Reaper's fingers flew across multiple keyboards, his screens filled with cascading lines of code. "Thorne's arrogant," Reaper muttered, his eyes locked on the screen. "He uses a private server for his business, thinks it's secure. But he connects it to his home network so he can work from his study. That's the door." John watched, his job now to provide security and to wait. He cleaned his rifle, the motions automatic, soothing. Each click of metal on metal was a countdown. "I'm in," Reaper said, a triumphant hiss. "Oh, you beautiful, stupid man. Financial records, emails, calendars. It's all here." He began downloading everything, routing the data through a series of encrypted proxies. Payoffs to the police chief, donations to Principal Davies's retirement fund, contracts that show him blackmailing business owners. It's a complete blueprint of his entire corrupt enterprise. As the files downloaded, Reaper turned his attention to another task. The attack on Sarah. The diversion was smart, but not smart enough. They used a burner phone to make the call, but the burner had to ping a tower, and I know which one. He cross-referenced the tower's location with surveillance footage from a gas station on the main road. "Gotcha," he whispered. He zoomed in on a grainy image, Kyle Thorne's car, pulling into the gas station 20 minutes before the attack, and in the passenger seat, his 2 friends. It placed them all at the scene. He then hacked into the cloud storage account of one of the other boys. He found the original, unedited video of the first assault on the porch. The one that proved Sarah was the victim. Clear's throat. The final piece of the puzzle came from a motion-activated security camera on a hunting cabin a quarter-mile from where Sarah was attacked. The owner was an out-of-towner who had given Amelia Vance the login credentials weeks ago. Reaper accessed the feed. There, clear as day, was the footage. Kyle and his friends running from the woods, their faces panicked. Kyle clutching his scratched cheek. It was undeniable. John looked at the mountain of evidence. It was more than enough. "There's a town hall meeting tomorrow night," John said, remembering a flyer he'd seen. "Thorne is the keynote speaker. The topic is community safety." Reaper grinned, a flash of white teeth in the dim light. The irony is delicious. The next evening, the town hall was packed. Marcus Thorne stood at the podium, basking in the applause of people who feared him. He was handsome, charismatic, the very picture of civic leadership. He spoke of values, of security, of protecting their way of life. John, Reaper, and Ben Carter stood at the back of the room. Doc was with Sarah, who, against her doctor's orders, had insisted on being there. She sat in a wheelchair near the side entrance, her bruised face a stark testament to the hypocrisy of Thorne's speech. Amelia Vance was in the front row, posing as a reporter for the local paper. She had a laptop connected to the hall's projector system, a connection Reaper had discreetly facilitated. Thorne was reaching the crescendo of his speech. "We will not tolerate violence or lawlessness in our town. We will stand together to ensure that our children are safe." "Then why isn't your son in jail?" The voice came from the back. It was John. Every head turned. Thorne squinted, his smile faltering. "I'm sorry," Thorne said, trying to regain control. "This isn't the time for—" "I think it is," Amelia Vance said, standing up. "Mr. Thorne, you speak of safety. But for whom?" Before Thorne or the compromised police chief could react, Amelia hit a key on her laptop. The large screen behind Thorne, which had been displaying the town seal, flickered. The first image to appear was the unedited video from Sarah's porch. The shove, the kick to the dog, the sneering faces of the boys with their phones. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thorne's face went pale. "Turn that off! This is an outrage!" But the video kept playing. Next, the gas station footage. Then, the damning footage from the hunting cabin, showing the boys fleeing the woods after the second assault. Reaper, from his phone, simultaneously emailed the complete file of evidence, the financial records, the videos, the witness statements, to every major news outlet in the state, as well as to the state police and the FBI. The castle walls were not just breached, they were being vaporized. As the footage played, a side door opened. Doc wheeled Sarah to the front of the room. She was holding a microphone. She looked directly at Marcus Thorne, her voice amplified by the speakers, filling the shocked silence. "You can't buy my silence," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "You can't beat me into silence. You and your son, you're the sickness in this town. And it's over." She then looked out at the crowd, at the faces of her neighbors. "I am not afraid of you anymore." It was then that the main doors of the town hall burst open. It wasn't the local police. It was a state police tactical team, led by a single, familiar face, Detective Miller, the one honest cop John's team had identified. He had received the evidence packet from Reaper and had immediately secured a warrant from a state judge, bypassing the local corrupt system entirely. "Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice," Miller announced, his voice booming. Two officers cuffed a stunned Thorne at the podium. Other officers moved through the crowd, arresting the police chief and Principal Davies, who looked as if he was about to faint. Kyle, who had been sitting in the front row, tried to bolt. He didn't get 2 steps before Doc's massive arm shot out, grabbing him by the collar and lifting him off his feet. "Kyle Thorne," Miller said, approaching him. "You're under arrest for felony assault." The arrests were swift, professional, and brutally public. The untouchable tyrant and his entire network were dismantled in front of the very people they had terrorized for years. The crowd, silent at first, began to applaud. It started with a few people, then grew into a thunderous ovation. It was the sound of a town taking its first breath of free air. The trial was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus Thorne, his son, the police chief, the principal, and several other accomplices were found guilty on all counts. The sentences were long. Justice, for once, was absolute. Weeks later, as life in the town began to find a new, healthier rhythm, there was a knock on John's cabin door. He opened it to find one of the boys who had been with Kyle during the first assault, the one who had filmed it. The boy stood on the porch, his head down, twisting a baseball cap in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears in his eyes. "I was scared. I should have done something. I'm so sorry." He had testified against Kyle in the trial, his guilt finally outweighing his fear. John looked at the boy for a long moment. He saw not a monster, but a child who had made a terrible choice out of weakness. He gave a single, slow nod of acceptance. It was all the absolution the boy needed. The incident had changed John. The well he had been digging sat unfinished. He no longer needed to bury his past. He had found a new purpose, not in forgetting, but in building. He used the money from his military pension, along with a few anonymous donations that came in after the story went national, to start a nonprofit foundation on his land. He built new kennels and a training course. He started taking in retired military dogs, animals like Max who were deemed too old or too troubled for service, but still had so much to give. He trained them to be service companions for veterans suffering from trauma, just as his own dog had been a companion for him. He was healing them, and in doing so, he was healing himself. The story ended where it began, on a porch. Not his porch, but Sarah's. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Sarah was out of her wheelchair, a faint scar on her cheek the only visible reminder of her ordeal. She was laughing, throwing a ball for Max, who chased after it with the energy of a puppy. John sat in a rocking chair, his own dog resting at his feet. He watched them, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. He had not sought out this fight, but it had found him. It had pulled him from the darkness and given him back his mission. Protect the innocent, defend the weak, keep the promise. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the will to act in spite of it. It is not about size or age or rank. It is a choice. A 17-year-old girl choosing to speak truth to power. A team of brothers who answered a call without question. A community that finally chose to stand together rather than stand by. God does not always remove the storm. Sometimes He calms the sailor, and sometimes He places strength inside ordinary people and loyal animals, turning them into the rock that breaks the tide, reminding the world that even in the deepest darkness, there is a light that will not be extinguished. John Creed looked at the girl and her dog, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt he was finally home. His war was over. A new one, A better one had just begun.